feverish, blood-soaked tragedy, Macbeth, Shakespeare presented a figure familiar to Jacobean audiences, that of the witch, a figure whose depiction and treatment would come to a hysterical climax in real-life witchcraft trials like Salem and Pendle. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, many tens of thousands of women and men were tortured, hanged, drowned, and burned alive for being witches across Europe and North America, Scandinavia and the Holy Roman Empire being fervent exponents of the purge on supposed sorcerers. During the 16th century, many people believed that witchcraft, rather than the workings of God's will, was a more convincing explanation for sudden and unexpected ill fortune, such as the death of a child, bad harvests, or the death of cattle. Witch hunting became an obsession in some parts of the country.
The witch craze really swept across Europe from the mid-15th to the mid-18th centuries. Now, it masqueraded as a genuine witch hunt. The Pope declared that witchcraft was heresy and that witches ought to be hunted down. But there's little doubt, really, that it was women hunting. About 85% of those persecuted were women, and they were on the edge of society. They were often poor, vulnerable. So it's actually a lot more horrific than it seems on the surface.
In England in particular, you could see the witchcraft trials and the way that women were treated as a war on women. The idea of women starting to have some agency, women reading and writing, which had happened with the Protestant Reformation. You see a lot of women starting to be more visible as thinkers. And it's quite interesting to think, okay, is that therefore a backlash? Is the obsession with witches about the backlash of women talking, women speaking, women reading in these public spaces? And I haven't yet written a novel set in the UK during that time period of the witch trials. But of course, nobody can read anything of Shakespeare, later Shakespeare in particular, and not know that it was becoming an obsessive thing by then.
Yeah, absolutely.
And certain parts of the country were becoming particularly affected by it.
I danced for the devil.
In 1542, Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act, which defined witchcraft as a crime punishable by death. It was repealed 5 years later, but restored by a new act in 1562. A further law was passed in 1604. The 1562 and 1604 Acts transferred the trial of witches from the church to the ordinary courts. Formal accusations against witches, who were usually poor, elderly women, reached a peak in the late 16th century, particularly in southeast England. 513 witches were put on trial there between 1560 and 1700, though only 112 were executed. The last known execution took place in Devon in 1685. The last trials were held in Leicester in 1717. Overall, some 500 people in England are believed to have been executed for witchcraft. In 1736, Parliament passed an act repealing the laws against witchcraft, but imposing fines or imprisonment on people who claimed to be able to use magical powers. When it was introduced in the Commons, the bill caused much laughter among MPs. Its promoter was John Conduit, whose wife was the niece of Sir Isaac Newton, a father of modern science, although keenly interested in the occult. The Act was repealed in 1951 by the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which in turn was repealed in 2008. In 1824, Parliament passed the Vagrancy Act, under which fortune-telling, astrology and spiritualism became punishable offences. But that wasn't always the case. In England, wise people were often valued members of communities, providing medical knowledge and treatment at a time when modern Western medicine was in its infancy.
Until the purge, wise people, wise women, even wise men, also known as healers, were a force for good in their local communities. They were sort of white witches, if you like, for many centuries, much more effective healers than actually the physicians and the apothecaries. Suddenly, though, they're seen with suspicion. When the witch hunts get underway, wise people are synonymous with black witches, and they are suspected of concocting spells to do harm to people, to murder people, to cause crops to fail, and the finger of suspicion is pointed very firmly at them.
Shakespeare based the story of Macbeth on the Holinshead Chronicles. The play, written in 1606, was clearly meant to pander to the newly crowned James I, who was obsessed with witchcraft and even had his own work published on the subject. The time James I spent in Denmark clearly defined his attitude towards witches, and some would argue towards women in general. But his relationship with his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was also a factor. He was brought up to have very little respect for her. She was hugely unpopular throughout Scotland, often labelled as a witch and a whore by the nobility. The three witches in the play make reference to events familiar to James, his queen and his court, and it could be argued that the character of Lady Macbeth herself is a fourth witch, with many productions using the same actress to play Lady Macbeth and one of the witches. The actual historical figure of Macbeth, Macbethad Macfindlich, and his wife Gruach were players in the political intrigue and power struggles which defined 11th century Scottish history. In the play, Shakespeare includes a prophecy that the character of Banquo would have royal descendants. At the time of writing, it was thought that James I was related to Banquo and therefore a rightful king. Convenient. But in the final analysis, the play, though fascinating, gory and violently satisfying in its poetic quest for revenge and justice, it does a huge disservice to women and indeed the historical figures, especially the Macbeths. Not only does it deliberately promote the idea of malevolent female actors actively working to maliciously affect the lives of good God-fearing people, including royalty, but it unfairly tarnishes the reputations of two historical characters whose real lives bore little relation to the characters in the play. There's no evidence to suggest Gruach was involved in witchcraft. Indeed, there is good evidence that she made pilgrimage to Rome with Macbeth in 1050. But none of that matters. Shakespeare's goal was to entertain the masses, as always, and to ingratiate himself to a new monarch by presenting stories and tropes familiar to him and his court.